Hello, I'm Miriam Kate, and I'm very excited to be here at the ARC conference in London. There are over 4,000 people from nearly 100 countries around the world, and we're talking about how to restore the foundations of civilization, the foundations that have given us freedom and prosperity, but now very much seem to be under threat. And I'm delighted to be joined by podcaster Winston Marshall, who's joined us here on the GBNews stand. Now, Winston, tell us about an online debate that's going on at the moment, all about what is our national story, because that's one of the things that ARC is here to talk about.
You're absolutely right. ARC is one of the many things, one of the streams being discussed is what is the narrative? What is the greater narrative about the future? But I guess to some extent, what is the narrative about the past? Something I've noticed and something I talk about on my show a lot, I ask guests, what is it to be British? What is it to be English? And every single guest gives a different answer. Not only that, I was speaking at Oxford University, I gave an Oxford University lecture for a Roger Scruton group, a room full of conservative students about English-British identity. I asked them, what do you think it is to be English-British? Every single one of them gave a different answer. One of them even said, there isn't anything to be English.
Wow.
Something I hear a lot is, to be English is fair play. It's, liberal democracy. I'm like, well, that's what the Americans have. So what are you talking about? That's not English. Everyone has a different answer, and no one agrees, and now it's just blown up on the internet, I think because there's an interview with Fraser Nelson, the journalist, on trigonometry with Constantine Kissin and Francis Foster, and they're arguing about what it is to be English. Now, Constantine is making the case that of course there's an ethnic component to being English, whereas Fraser is saying, no, if you're born in England and you're raised in England, you are English. And they're at loggerheads and they can't see past each other. This is blown up, and I've heard people say, for example, Majid Nawaz, saying if you're from England, he is not ethnically English, but he's from England, so he feels like he's English. He's been on my show as well. He said to be English is a feeling. Now, I think they're all wrong.
Okay.
There are a few things that can be true simultaneously.
Yeah.
It is true that there is an ethnicity which is to be English. For example, there are the ethnic English in America. In fact, there are some people who are fully ethnically English who might have been in America for centuries, but it would be ludicrous to say that they are English in the terms, certainly they're not administratively English, which is another type of English. You might have all the papers that say, you have the passport, you are English, but you might not buy into the culture. It's also true that there's cultural Englishness, there's a heritage. Now, my personal belief is that it's true that there is an ethnicity, it's true that you can be administratively English, they're separate things, but really the truth is, to be English, to be of any nation, is to take on the heritage of the nation as if it is yours, so that's part one, and part two, to actively participate in that heritage. So, I'll give you an example. Elon Musk, he is not from America, he was born in South Africa. He's even ethnically English, but he is obviously American. Yeah. My mum has lived in this country for nearly 40 years. She's a French woman. She's not actually ethnically French, she's ethnically Jewish and Italian. But if you meet her, to say that she is English because she's been here 40 years, ludicrous. And she'd be insulted by the fact she's a French woman. So these things happen and at different levels. I'll give you another sort of counter example, seeing as that we're at a Jordan Peterson event. Jordan talks a lot about the Old Testament. When Israel was wandering in the desert, it was a nation without a state. It was a people who certainly argued about what their heritage was, and they argued about where exactly they were heading, but they all had, to some extent, enough agreed upon heritage and agreed upon the fact that they were arguing about where to go sort of implied that they agreed that they should be going together.
They had a commonality.
They had some commonality. And that is what it is to be of a people. And I think it's important because what we're seeing in the populist revolt over the last 10, 15 years, particularly the last 5 years, is the sovereigntists against the globalists.
Yeah.
And so the globalist types, the progressive types, they see it all as nationalistic and negative, and they conjure up images of the 1940s. But actually there's a positive populism, there's a positive patriotism that we have to be able to articulate, and we've failed in articulating what that is. We should not be embarrassed about discussing what it is to be English.
So what is it? What is the common story? I mean, the stories that we tell ourselves, or certainly we did in history when I was growing up, about the Second World War and heroism and fighting the Nazis, or do you go back further to the Tudors? What is unique about our story that can give us that shared heritage? I think the left often talk about values, this nebulous idea of British values that they seem to think is diversity, which I think frankly is a load of rubbish. But being English isn't really about values, or it is in so much as we can derive them from our history. So what are the kind of unique bits of our history that mark our Englishness as different to just Western, let's say?
Excellent question. I do think that there are English values, but values is only one part of the pot, because you can have people with completely different values who are both English. History, language, values, they're all part of the pie of being an English person. When it comes to history specifically, now the Jews are lucky because they have a book, so to some extent they can all sort of say, well, we agree on the deep ancient history.
Uniquely, Judaism is both a race and a nation and a religion.
Yes.
So they have a kind of triple lock on their identity.
But we do to some extent as well. You know, we are, there are the ethnically English. I'm only partly ethnically English. I have friends, so I would say, who are English, who aren't ethnically English. I believe that Marcus Rashford is an Englishman, not because he's ethnically English, he's obviously not, but he participates in the heritage of England in his domain of football. By participating, putting on the Three Lions shirt, he is actively participating in the heritage of the England football team, and that is a version of it. When it comes to our history, we don't teach this properly in school, but I would say our founding king was Alfred the Great, although there's even debate there because he was the first king of the English, uniting the English tribes against the Great Heathen Army. The Great Heathen Army, who of course were pagans, of course were Scandinavian. Some of them were born in England. It would be ludicrous to say they're English. Athelstan was the first king of England as the territory that we know it. And then from that we have this amazing heritage which includes King Alfred's Dombock, which I think might be the first founding document of English common law. There is Magna Carta, of course. There's the Reformation's an important part of our history. Again, with the Reformation, you can be Catholic, like I'm Catholic, and still be English. But there's part of it's a complicated
It's
picture.
a kind of an overarching adherence to this shared story, but also it's about what we're aiming at, isn't it? Because you talked about the Israelites. They argued amongst themselves all the time, but when it was important, they knew how to come together to know what they were aiming at. Is that taking the promised land? Is that building the temple? Whatever that is. So what, as English people, are we aiming at?
I would say that it's unlikely that all of us will ever fully agree. In fact, it's impossible that all of us agree on what direction.
But in a time of crisis, so let's say one of the things out in the poll this week, just 11% of Gen Z would fight for this country. Now that's obviously very frightening. If we do have a time of crisis, we can disagree about everything, but if we were to face a war or something like that, you'd need 90% of people at least to come together under the same aim.
I think part of the reason that young people think that is, firstly, they've been taught it in schools. Instead of being taught that we are the people that defeated Napoleon, we are the people that defeated slavery at great cost and at the cost of thousands of Englishmen who gave their life to defeat slavery. We are the people who defeated Nazism and Hitler. Instead, they are taught that we are the perpetrators of slavery. We are we are nationalistic with our empire. There's all of this, it's a reversal of the truth. Now you also hear it from conservatives, that Churchill, American conservatives, saying Churchill was the real villain of World War II. Are you joking? He saved civilization, he defeated Nazism. So we're getting it from all sides. As to your question about whether these, what for the future, these young people, there's a famous story about the Oxford Union debating, I think in 1937. That we, on no condition will we fight and die for our country, and of course...
2 years later.
I may be wrong on the dates, it might have been
earlier in the 30s, but not a long way away.
And then, of course, that was the generation that sacrificed their lives.
So when the need calls. How do you think immigration changes this debate? Because when there are small amounts of immigration, or when the immigration is very much people who come here and then assimilate very quickly or come from similar cultural nations, then you can see how the majority of Englishness kind of carries on and you have social cohesion. We've now got the situation where in England, 36% of school children are ethnic minority. Of course, the majority of them were born here, but we've now got this real fragmentation of our national story. Is it even possible to come back together again under one kind of unifying story?
It's actually the most important, salient issue of our time in this country, and that's why the issue of who we are is so important. How are we going to tell people what to assimilate and integrate into if we ourselves cannot articulate who we are? And so that's something we've got to work out. I think there is an example of someone who's successfully making multiculturalism work. Now, it's Catherine Burblesing who's speaking here. In her school, she has all her students, no matter what their race, creed, and religion, every morning they sing the national anthem.
Yeah.
Because we are a monarchy. We have a monarchy,
yeah.
And they have the national flag. There are some basics that that there is a common culture that we can include these subcultures in. In America, they do this with the founding fathers had the term e pluribus unum. They understood that it was a nation of multiculturals, but they also have a common culture to unite all, which they did with the American Declaration, which was absolutely genius. The problem we have, unlike the Americans, is they have a set of ideas. We are actually a culture and a history. We're not an idea, I don't think, which although there's some debate about that.
Yes, we have things like the coronation and things like that that re-emphasize all the traditions. One final question. There's a lot of talk here about how Christianity or Judeo-Christian values are the foundation of the West, and that we can't possibly rediscover those foundations without rediscovering what the values are of the Bible, essentially. Do you think that's true? Is it possible to conserve what we once had without looking again at the basics that we were built on, the idea that we're made in the image of God, the idea that we should treat each other how we should be treated ourselves?
A very good question, of which I think in this room there's a lot of division on this, and we don't all agree, because there's a lot of culturally Christians who would say, actually, I'm atheist or I'm agnostic, but I understand the significant importance of Christianity. I think the question is, if you don't actually believe in the resurrection, doesn't the whole thing crumble? Which is kind of my position. It's all good and say, yeah, like I think it's useful to believe in Christianity to keep this whole thing going, and I think we do need that. But I would go on to argue that if it's not true, then doesn't the whole thing crumble? And
even human rights, which has been warped out of all proportion, is based on the idea that we are all equal before God. That's
human
where
rights
it's come from.
Have come from Christianity, absolutely. That it doesn't exist in it came from Christendom. Yeah. It came from those fundamental, the invention of freedom, the invention of the individual, all came from Christianity through Christ's teachings and what we learned from the Greeks, the Romans, and of course the Jews, who are absolutely fundamental. I do think that, back to Catherine Burblesing, she has the national flag. It is a Christian cross. We are a Christian nation. It doesn't mean we can't have other religions and faiths participate, but even they will admit it is a Christian nation.
And they're the foundational values.
Yeah.
Winston Marshall, thank you so much
Miriam,
for talking
pleasure.
to me. Really good conversation, and there'll be plenty more from GB News throughout this conference with lots of interesting guests. Thanks for watching.
Thanks,
Great.
Miriam.
That was superb. Thanks, Winston.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. That was great.
Great.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Yeah, good. I'll see you later. So?
I'll see you later. Good luck.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
You know this stuff's like...
I know, yeah. Great. Oh, thank you. That's good.
Right, great.
Ladies and gentlemen,